I've been wanting to do this vlog for a long time. Um, it required me to really gather my thoughts because this is sort of a deep issue and kind of an in-depth argument, so bear with me. We're going to be using primarily the work of a philosopher, Richard A. Wasserstrom, and another philosopher, Marilyn Frye. And we're going to start with the work of Wasserstrom and his essay called Racism, Sexism, and Preferential Treatment. Now, we'll loop back around to the preferential treatment part, but I want to talk about his analysis of racism and sexism. And what he's particularly talking about is a look at the reality of the world. So he goes in and he says, all right, let's take a look at the world. Um, and he is specifically talking about the legal system here, but you can apply this to normal everyday people. He says that there's overt racism in some cases. An example of this was when blacks in America could not vote, right? Like legally, they were not allowed to vote. That is overt legal racism. The law is just not even hiding that it's doing something racist. Um, then there's covert legal racism, and this is a good example of this is the grandfather law, which was introduced in some states after blacks were given the right to vote. And the grandfather law said that in order for you to vote in these states, your grandfather had to be registered to vote. Now, if you were black, your grandfather wasn't registered to vote because he was black and he couldn't vote. Um, so then you had to go and take this test, and the test was obviously meant to be a huge pain in the ass. So it was something that was intentionally racist, but it was hidden a little bit, just so that you can make this law and say, "Oh no, this isn't racist. This is to preserve the integrity of our votes because people are going to have to take this test, or they have a history of voting in their family, so they really know what it's about." Um, and these are very clear cut. It's not really something that you can argue they happen in America. One is overtly racist, the other is covertly racist, but they're both intentionally trying to discriminate against black people. And the real shitty thing about the grandfather law is not only did your grandfather have to be able to vote, it wasn't that you had to be a third generation American. It was that your grandfather had to be able to vote. So if you didn't go take the test, then as long as the law stood, your grandchildren wouldn't be able to vote, and your children certainly wouldn't be able to vote. So it was really bad. Um, he goes on to talk about a third type of racism, which is institutional racism. Um, and institutional racism, I think, gets a little bit more fuzzy. Now, um, he uses two arguments to talk about it. The first argument is black men being tried by a jury. Legally, the jury cannot be all white, but he goes on to talk about how this sort of it's an institutional thing based on like the experiences of people and how they're different in the country, so that it's important that the jury for a black man be have racial variety in it. I think that part of his argument was a little bit weak. Maybe it's just something I can't connect to because I'm white as hell. Um, and he has a second argument, which I think holds a little bit more water, which is a slightly different type of institutional racism. Now he's gonna talk about Brown, and Brown is a court case that happened in the United States of America, where the schools were segregated, and Brown went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "Yeah, we can't segregate schools." And they split it. They had Brown 1 and Brown 2, which is really weird because generally when the Supreme Court says something can't happen, they say, this can't happen, stop doing it, that's it. But for Brown, they didn't. They had the first part where they said, this can't happen, and then they made Brown 2 where they argued about how to desegregate. And the problem with desegregation is because the black schools were really shitty. So if you're desegregating, how do you do that? Because one school cannot hold all these people. You still need to have two schools for, the basis of having all these children. And the way that the United States did it is that the the black children would continue to go to their shitty black schools, and the white children would go to the much nicer schools. And that's a problem. So they said this is wrong, but it's going to continue to exist until the black schools can be made better. And right, that seems weird. That seems weird because it should just be like that you just sort of stop it, or that you desegregate both schools and you have people just go to whatever schools they're closer. But the idea was that the Supreme Court looked at the black schools and said, these are so bad, we cannot send white children here. So we must make them better before white children can go there, and we can desegregate these schools and have white children and black children go to the same schools and just have it go based on whatever you're closer to. And so it's the fact that they waited, and the way that they waited was to have black children continue in these schools. He's saying that that's kind of the part, or not even kind of, that is the part that's racist, and it's an institutional racism. It's a little bit more subtle. I don't think the lens of race is easy to use or talk about for this, so I want to switch essays. And let's talk about Marilyn Frye's essay just called Sexism. And in this essay, she attempts to give a definition of sexism, and she does. She starts with an initial definition. That is, the term sexist, in its core and perhaps most fundamental meaning, is a term which characterizes anything, whatever, which creates, constitutes, promotes, or exploits any irrelevant or impertinent marking of the distinction between the sexes. So basically, when you go to school, and you reach, it was like 5th grade for me, the boys go to shop, and the girls go to home ec. Now, my school didn't actually do this. You went to shop, and then you went to home ec, and then you chose your 3rd year. But that's, this guy wrote, or this essay was written in like the 80s or something, or maybe the 90s. Either way. Right, that's the classic thing. And yet, there is nothing really about the sexes and like the biological difference that means that men should go to shop and use a saw, and women should go to home ec and use an egg beater, right? Like, that sex is irrelevant there. So she's arguing that that's sexist. Um, so she goes on to say that she actually doesn't like this definition. Um, so anyway, she says that she doesn't really like this definition, and the problem with this definition is a hypothetical scenario, and basically, oh man, let me just find and see what she says about it. So a company is hiring a supervisor who's going to supervise a group of male workers, a group entirely of male workers who have always worked for male supervisors, right? You can't really deny that sex is irrelevant there. They have always worked for male supervisors. They would be more comfortable taking orders from a male supervisor. As a result, by the original definition, it does not seem sexist to hire a less qualified male supervisor over a more qualified female supervisor, regardless of the fact that the female can give all the orders and do all the timings at the correct time, perhaps better than the guy. Um, basically the problem is that her sex becomes relevant here when it shouldn't be. It's not a function of her biology. It's a function of that she is female, and somehow that's relevant when it kind of shouldn't be. And she argues that that's really like where she needs to improve her definition of sexism. So let's jump into this. Basically, in our society, we gender mark all the fucking time. And if you pay attention, you'll notice this. When you meet a man or a woman for the first time, you will generally interact with them differently. You'll make eye contact for different periods of time. You'll shake their hand differently. You'll greet them with a different tone of voice. Um, it intrudes into every moment of your life. Um, these gender markings are like the gender markings and the way that you approach people are everywhere. A couple enters a restaurant, and the hostess addresses the man instead of the woman, makes eye contact with the man, and says, "How many seats would you like?" Right? Um, you congratulate your friend with a hug, slap on the back, shaking hands, and you would do that differently if your friend were a man or a woman. Um, even social, like even being afraid to talk to girls in real life is an example of this. It's not that treating men and women differently is it's just the fact that people treat men and women differently at all, when it really their sex really doesn't matter, right? And I'm not arguing that this is bad. I am just saying it is a fact that men and women are treated differently when it's kind of irrelevant, right? If I go and greet my friend who is a woman, I greet her in a certain way. It has nothing to do with the fact that she can get pregnant. Like, it doesn't. But it's just the fact that people treat men and women differently. That's the way our society works. Sex identification intrudes into every moment of our lives. It's in the way we talk, it's in the way we greet people, it's in everything. And Marilyn Fry is going to go on to argue that this is a system, and the thing is that sexism, or not even sexism, yeah, no, sexism. Sexism is very deeply rooted in society, and it's very strange. But people treat men and women differently when it's almost irrelevant, and we have all these weird gender roles and stuff. The culture, she's going to say, the cultural and economic structures which create and enforce elaborate and rigid patterns of sex marking and sex announcing behavior, that is, create gender as we know it, mold us as dominators and subordinates. They construct two classes of animal, the masculine and the feminine, where another constellation of forces might have constructed 3 or 5 categories and not necessarily hierarchically related or such a spectrum of sorts that we would not experience them as sorts at all. But it does happen, and you can't really argue that. So she's going to get a final definition of the term sexist. We can talk about this a bit later. The term sexist characterizes cultural and economic structures which create and enforce the elaborate and rigid patterns of sex marking and sex announcing which divide the species along the lines of sex into dominators and subordinates. Individual acts and practices are sexist, which reinforce and support those structures, either as culture or as shapes taken on by the encultured animals. Resistance to sexism is that which undermines those structures by social and political action and by projects of reconstruction and revision of ourselves. I don't care whether you agree with this, but it is an important jumping off point to start thinking about institutional sexism and institutional racism, and the fact that this is deeply ingrained in our culture, and it's very hard to look at because it's part of who you are. Let's jump back to Wasserstrom's article, and the first part about this. It's the first part of his article. It's where he starts off, but it's not really where I like to start off when I'm explaining this. He says, and his article is very much about affirmative action, which is a process in which a company says, we have too many white people, so we're going to hire more black people, more Asians, and we have to fulfill quotas. That's kind of shitty. And he says, well, people look at it in really weird ways, and the way to analyze it is this. He says, you look at the reality. You look at the situation and you say, my company is predominantly white. And you look at the ideal and you say, well, ideally, my culture, or my company, race wouldn't matter at all. It would just be whatever people happen to be, whatever race people happen to be, but they're because of merit or whatever qualities they bring the company. And you look at the reality, you look at the ideal, and you say, how can we bridge that gap? So when you're talking about something like affirmative action, you're talking about a bridge between issue A and issue B. I think we can apply this to esports. We look at competitive gaming and we say, there aren't that many women in competitive gaming. There are not that many women in casting or production or players or coaching or whatever. There are some, but there are not as many as there are men. That's the reality. What's the ideal is that we've got esports is integrated. There are men, there are women, and it doesn't really matter. Sex isn't really relevant. That's the ideal. Now, I don't think we're really there. So then you look at it, or even in pro players. Smite has no female pro players. The ideal is that you'd have some if they were good at the game and stuff. Um, and so now you start thinking of ways to bridge that gap, ways to make the jump. And that is the context in which you should analyze something like an all women's tournament. You would not look and be like, well, it's a tournament for all women, so that's fucking sexist because there's only women. You look and you say, okay, they're trying to bridge this gap from a male dominated thing to an integrated thing. How effective is this at this? Now, I'd go on and argue to say that it's not effective. It's probably just counterproductive, so it sucks anyway. I'm not saying that, all women's tournaments are good. They're stupid. But you have to look at them in the appropriate context. And the appropriate context is a mechanism to bridge the gap from the reality to the ideal. And I think that's really important when you're talking about issues of racism and sexism. So just to recap, a few different types of racism and sexism. Overt, which is someone being sexist, someone saying, you're a woman, so you can't do this because women suck at video games. Yeah, we'll just use esports as examples. Overt is someone saying, you're a woman and you're bad at Call of Duty, so stop making YouTube videos because you're bad and you'll never be good. And someone actually said this on Twitter the other day. It was really weird. Then there's covert sexism, where that's a little bit harder to find an example of in people, but it does happen. It's when someone is going to be like kind of doing the same thing, but without trying to like without just saying it. So using the same example, a woman is playing Call of Duty or whatever, and this guy is gonna like try and feed on her. Yeah, a woman is playing Smite, and a guy tries to feed on her team so that she loses and doesn't get promoted to the next division or whatever. That would be covert sexism. I'm not saying anyone. Well, someone's probably done that. People do a lot of shitty things, but that would be like covert sexism, right? Like where you're overtly sexist or overtly racist, but you're hiding it because you know it's not socially acceptable to be overtly a dick, to not hide it. And then there's institutional racism and sexism. It's a lot harder to think about, a lot harder to talk about, and I think the most important thing to tackle, but it's just like the stuff that is embedded into our culture, that is kind of a part of who we are. And I'm not saying that part of who you are is bad, but I am saying that you should examine the shit out of it because it is there. And you need to understand that. And you want to work on that. Like they're all cultural notions that are a part of you. They're a part of who you are. They're the way that you were raised. And thinking critically about them and trying to understand the context that they have in your life is super important. And then you go through using these ideas and you can look at systems and you can say, okay, esports, not that many women. Ideally, it would have some based on merit or whatever. What can we do to get there? Or someone suggested this. How could we examine it as a bridge from reality to ideal? What is their perception of the reality? What is their perception of the ideal? So I think what I'm attempting to do here is I'm trying to give you trying to tell you to think about institutional racism, sexism, and how it's a part of who you are and your society and the people around you. And two, because it fucking is. And two, um, sort of a way to think about these issues when people actually try to apply them. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you for watching. If you're watching this in Twitch chat, we'll talk about it in a few. Um, Best way to support this channel is through Patreon, which is linked down below. And I will see you guys next time. I'm going to land, so it might be a while, but support eager. Peace.